I don't believe that there are single solutions that can boil the ocean, so to speak.
Right.
And I'd rather people just give me the information, the data, or whatever I need, and I usually specify what I need or what I'm looking for, so that I and my staff could make our own conclusions and pick what was best for us. We always felt we knew better. So that way I feel more invested and it just used to irk me sometimes after a meeting. I'd have to go walk the halls for a couple of minutes and clear my head and shake it.
Well, what if you run into a vendor that can make sandwiches for you? Or wash
Well,
your
as a public servant, you can't accept those kinds of gifts under most circumstances. So I would politely say, thank you, but no thank you. They want to give me a cup of coffee, that's okay. And
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of John Has Trust Issues, where we talk about issues in zero trust and cybersecurity and different things like that in a few minutes. Today, I am very, very honored and thrilled to have with us Michele Thomas, aka the Cyber Sherpa. Michele, welcome to the show.
thank you. It's good to be here.
And so we have a tradition on this show, Michele, and that tradition is to talk about our trust issue. So, what trust issue do you have, Michele?
Well, one of my trust issues when I was a CISO and even a CTO was with vendors who think they know it all. There have been times when organizations need the truth and they want a simplistic explanation or just a different way of understanding something. And my issue was with people who thought that they knew it all and that their product or their service solved all of my problems and my organization's problems. And I don't believe that there are single solutions that can boil the ocean, so to speak.
Right.
And I'd rather people just give me the information, the data, or whatever I need, and I usually specify what I need or what I'm looking for, so that I and my staff could make our own conclusions and pick what was best for us. We always felt we knew better. So that way I feel more invested and it just used to irk me sometimes after a meeting. I'd have to go walk the halls for a couple of minutes and clear my head and shake it.
Well, what if you run into a vendor that can make sandwiches for you? Or wash
Well,
your
as a public servant, you can't accept those kinds of gifts under most circumstances. So I would politely say, thank you, but no thank you. They want to give me a cup of coffee, that's okay. And let me tell you, there were a lot of meetings at Starbucks and Pete's and other places.
That's awesome. So, Michele, I'm going to go right into it, and I look forward to having our discussion today. So, I'm going to go right into it. You've been, speaking about, being a public servant. You've been a CISO, you've been a CISO, you've been a CTO, and just generally speaking, you've had an amazing career. So
Thanks.
tell us a bit more beyond what your LinkedIn profile told me. I looked you up on LinkedIn, of course, and we're connected anyway.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
but it looks amazing, right? So tell us a little bit more than what you show on LinkedIn.
sure. It actually has been amazing. I've had 27 years in public service, and I've also had 11 in the private sector. So I got to do some pretty cool things on both sides. And I've been doing what we call cybersecurity since before it was called cybersecurity. It used to be called information security and then information assurance. So I've been around it for a while. My interest came when in the late 80s, I was asked to write a program to encrypt financial data, private sector, that had to be transmitted around the world on an X25 network.
Mhm.
And nobody had successfully done that. Well, far be it from me not to take up a challenge, right? And I was always good at programming and math. So I said, okay, I can do this. I can do this. Well, after several failures, I got it. And the long and short of it is, I took the challenge. I won. I created an algorithm, and it took them 5 years to break it.
Right,
So I considered that a success, and that's how I got into security.
right. Not a whole lot of people know what an X25 network is anymore. So there's
Yeah. I remember transitioning from X25 to TCP/IP.
No, that's yeah. I
Yeah.
wasn't for that, but yeah, no, I do know what an X25 network is. No, that's awesome. And really, I really like that aspect of what you just mentioned, right? That, and in fact, I had a very similar conversion, if you will, or maybe not conversion, but how I got into the industry is very much like how you mentioned, right? We didn't call it cybersecurity back then, right? But it was part of what you did. So
Mhm.
for those that are listening today, maybe touch on that aspect of it, right? The aspect of security being a core component of our jobs, especially for practitioners.
Well, it's been a core component even when I was not a CISO.
Mhm.
So as a CTO, for example, I was deputy CTO at the Department of Labor and building cybersecurity into emerging technologies was quite the feat, right? Because it was new. Any emerging technology, the last thing most people will think of is cybersecurity.
Right,
But today you can't afford not to. And so one of the things that we all learned, I think, whether we were in the public or the private sector, is that we have to keep it top of mind because it's often forgotten.
right,
And as a CISO or a CTO or even a CIO, you can't be far from that because
right,
literally your job depends on it. Your survival and your job can depend on it.
right. Yeah,
I
that's
always used to tell people, sorry, I always used to tell people, you're just a headline away from the front page of the Washington Post.
true.
And that had meaning more, 5 years ago than it does today because everybody's on the front page of the Washington Post.
So if everybody's on the front page, except for except for
Don't
the
go there.
well, except for now that I mean I think a huge part of the difference though is that I mean those of us that have been in the industry for a while, I mean yes of course, right, but now a lot of what we see today, a lot of the headlines that we see today are regular people being affected by what's going on. A lot of info stealing of personal data, of healthcare data, et cetera. So it's definitely affecting. I know like people in my world who are not in cybersecurity or even in technology, they're always asking me questions of they see a headline, does that mean that my stuff is out there?
Pretty much everybody's stuff is out there.
Yeah, of course.
I call it the seize the data wars because everybody's trying to get it's all about the data, right?
Right.
And everybody's trying to get onto it, and many are succeeding. It's unfortunate.
Hence the name of the show, having trust issues, right?
Yeah, really.
Um, so no, great background. Thank you for walking us through that. So, given that you have such an extensive background in public sector and private sector cybersecurity, a topic that's very close to the show here, one that I talk about publicly in other forums, is zero trust. Something not new anymore, but something that has gone through many different iterations since its inception. And certainly, we have friends that were there since the beginning of when zero trust was coined as a term, right? But my question for you on zero trust is, what does it mean to you, given all of the different experiences that you've had?
Mm. That's an interesting question that I think about a lot in many ways. I also have a lot of opinions about it because over the years I've learned an awful lot. I think I never really stopped learning, and in order to I've learned how to do things much more successfully versus not so successfully over the years. And so some people think zero trust hasn't been out for that long, but it actually has. When I came up in the cybersecurity field, the expression was trust but verify,
Mhm.
and that was coming out. And now it's zero trust. It's a framework. It's a strategy where we don't trust anybody or anything, and we verify everyone and everything every time. And so some people have said, well, now it's never trust, always verify, but I think it's a little more than that.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's risk management, like a lot of other things, right? And risk mitigation. And how do you balance it with the business needs of a company or an agency? The bottom line is, does a vendor's product help me do business more securely? And from a risk management or risk mitigation standpoint, is it an investment in the product that's going to lower my risk and help my business bring value to being more resilient? And then if you're a public company, to the shareholders, right? So it's all about the money at the end of the day in some cases, but we're going to come back to value because it's something that I think is often forgotten. Well,
Right.
what is the value that the zero trust product, whatever pillar it falls under, is going to bring? We're bombarded constantly with zero trust marketing, right? And
Right.
every vendor puts their twist on zero trust, and definitions vary slightly. You can Google what zero trust means, and once you get past the ads that Google puts at the top, you can find a dozen easily, right? This is what zero trust is. And it's often used as a generic marketing term too. Oh, we have zero trust products and we qualify, or we do this, that, or the other. But the interesting thing is that, to me at least, is that many vendors claim to have the zero trust solution, and I'm of the opinion that one solution doesn't do everything, right? And so what might work for a global company that's on every continent and has, 1 million employees is not necessarily good for a small business. And
Right.
so, I think vendors need to adapt that mindset. There's an awful lot of good products on the market, depending on what area you might want to focus on, whether it's identity or data or network. Um, there are two other points that I want to make before I go on that just came to me, and they apply to the question for me that you just asked. So, cybersecurity practitioners and cybersecurity executive leaders always, they crave more information, and zero trust isn't, exempt from that. Everybody wants more information.
Right.
What does it do for me? What does it mean to me? But unfortunately, there are more conferences and webinars that focus on the technical as opposed to the executive side or point of view, right? And so this is why I see a lot of executives who are craving more information. They ask me, they ask others, they ask you probably. But this is something that I think needs to be talked about more. And the second thing is, in both the public and the private sectors, there is technical debt.
Right.
There, you don't hear about it so much in the public sector, or the private sector rather, but it's there. We
Right.
all know it's there in the public sector. There are legacy systems everywhere, and any zero trust solution has to understand this and take it into account. And there are a lot of really brilliant products out there. I mean, your company makes one, right? But does it necessarily adapt to everybody's business need? That's the question. And I think it was a couple years ago, Gartner said that by 2028, 20% of cybersecurity leaders are going to overinvest in zero trust. And part of that, I think, is due to marketing hype, to miscommunication, to not targeting the right audience, and to unrealistic expectations. I won't name the agency, but in the past 3 years, I've worked at an agency where the CIO said, I want one product that does everything. And I said, that doesn't exist, sir. But I was given my marching orders, so I said, aye, aye. And I didn't find it, but I got as close as I could. But the point is that there isn't that nirvana, extra special product doesn't exist. And so we end up in vendor lock situations. And we saw the impact of that very recently with CrowdStrike, right?
Right.
And so everybody learned a lot. And
Yeah.
one of the things I like about what you guys are doing is you take one bite out of zero trust,
Mhm.
you do it very well, you do it clearly, and you're doing it in a way that can be easily consumed.
Mhm.
And so there are a lot of other vendors that can do that. I've been there, I've seen it, I've witnessed it, heard it, but I think there needs to be more of that so that we understand that we need to be able to communicate our business need, but we also understand that what we're getting is actually going to address that business need.
Right. And yeah, no, so you definitely bring up a lot of really good points. And I was kind of in a jokingly kind of way, right? There are some vendors in our industry, obviously, that, definitely do preach platformization versus best of breed, right? So that's definitely
Mhm,
that as an industry we're having to cope with for exactly the reasons you just talked about. And
mhm,
so thanks for bringing it up. And so I really like the way you describe the way that private sector sees zero trust versus the way that the public sector does, right? There's a lot of times I think maybe if you can touch on this a little bit as a nuance of that part of the conversation is that in the public sector, those are real mandates, that are coming down
mhm,
either from executive orders or et cetera, right? Whereas in the private sector, we do things, not necessarily through mandates, but maybe we had a breach of some sort, or there's some kind of regulatory aspect to things, right?
mhm.
But could you maybe touch on a little on that topic a little bit?
On the differences between the two?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
how how private sector thinks about zero trust versus how public sector does.
Well, one of the one of the first things that comes to mind is the private sector revenue is much more up there and important in the private sector than it is for the most part in the public sector. There are some government agencies who do generate revenue through licensing and things of that nature, but by and large, it's taxpayer money that we used, right? And we had to be good stewards of that.
Right.
That's not the case, obviously, in the private sector, but I think there is there's a lot of similarities between the two.
Mhm.
But the things that I mentioned in my last answer still apply to the private sector. It's still about the business. It's still about we call it more the mission in the public sector than in the private sector, but it really is about the business. What does a particular agency do? Department of Transportation. Well, there are all about all different modes of transportation, including bicycles and pedestrians, right? And then airplanes with the FAA. USDA has varied missions, but it all has to do with agriculture. But I would add that as far as cybersecurity and zero trust is, we're all looking at the same things. And you said there may not be mandates other than maybe some regulatory mandates, but I would venture to guess that if a large company had a significant data breach,
Mhm.
that mandates would come from on high on what's going to happen. And there are good and bad consequences to a breach, right? You bring visibility to the fact that maybe, oh, your CEO has been cutting your cybersecurity budget, and now all of a sudden you got all the money you need to make the improvements that are going to mitigate what happened. But it's no different on the federal side. Our budgets get cut
Right.
and we have to reallocate monies, and sometimes you may not get all the money that you need to do the things that you set out to do. So I think that's very similar. I think in the private sector, there may be a perception that I see coming up in the press, and I hear it being talked about the responsibility on the private sector side for meeting cybersecurity, not just regulations, but just basic cybersecurity hygiene, right? And so we read about some of these breaches that happen and we find out that, well, they weren't doing that. And I've posted about this on LinkedIn, but I've also read a lot about the fact that the Department of Justice is now using the False Claims Act to go after companies, private companies that are doing business on government contracts. They could be third or fourth parties, right? When you think about a company that makes something like airplanes, they may have up to 3,000 third party and fourth party partners. And that's a heck of a job to have to monitor all of those relationships to make sure that they're following. But now the government is starting to go after them because they have contracts upon which the government relies and has a legal relationship with, right? A contractual relationship. And so it's really interesting to see how everybody's due diligence to protecting data, which by the way is one of the pillars of zero trust, right? I find it significant that companies that do business with the government, whether they're a prime, a second, third, or fourth party or whatever, sometimes they let's just say that what DOJ is doing is getting their attention. They don't think about it as much. They may be a small company. They may not have the funding to do what they need to do, but they need to find it and they need to find it quickly because we're starting to see how widespread the implications of these breaches are.
Right.
So, that's not exclusive to the private sector. Maybe a decade ago, and I'm guessing, I may be wrong, a government agency didn't follow good cybersecurity practices, and that agency lost its access to the internet for a couple of years.
Wow.
Can you imagine doing
Wow.
business without access to the internet? There was special circumstances under which it could be used, but for the most part, the employees didn't have access to the internet.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
that was, front page news. It's not classified information or anything. I'm making a point, and that is that there are consequences to not following the rules, and the rules in different areas vary, but there are rules. And there's also common sense, right? You don't keep people's social security numbers in unencrypted fields anymore.
Exactly.
They're already on the dark web, but still.
No, right? At least show us that you're trying. Hey everybody, John Martinez here. Please continue on to part 2 of my amazing interview with Michele Thomas.